This is Boulogne in northern France. For centuries, when English travellers visited France, this was one of the first places they saw. Today, many just come to stock up on cheap wine. But in 1787, an Englishman called Arthur Young came here to begin a journey that would take him all over France. Like a modern-day travel writer, he published a book, A Tour of France in the years 1787, 1788 and 1789.
That's the year the French Revolution began.
Exactly, which is why the book's important. It's a snapshot of France as it was, a portrait of the old regime. You want to know what France was like before the Revolution? You can't do better.
So what was France like before the Revolution?
The town of Boulogne is flourishing. The buildings are in good repair, the place on the whole is cheerful, and the environ's pleasing.
That's Arthur Young on Boulogne. Not very revealing. No clues there as to why France would erupt in revolt. But from Boulogne, Arthur Young headed out into the countryside. And pretty soon he put his finger on the problems of pre-revolutionary France.
I had imagined that nobody but farmers and labourers lived in the country, but I was wrong. My first journey showed me a score of country estates. They are furnished at great expense. Yet all around are pitiful scenes. Miserable housing, peasants like walking dunghills. You pass at once from grandeur to beggary, from the most splendid luxury to misery in mud cabins.
Misery in mud cabins. It's a pretty grim image. Was it true?
Well, here's a fact. 80% of people in pre-revolutionary France were peasants. A few worked their own land, most worked other people's, and they had to pay half of what they produced each year in rent to the local landowner. Add to that taxes paid to the state and to the church, there wasn't much left.
Meanwhile, the nobles in their chateau didn't pay tax at all. That was their privilege. The theory was they fought for the king in times of war, they paid their tax in blood. But by the 1780s, that whole idea was out of date. And anyway, the honest system was corrupt. If you had money, you could buy lands and titles. You could buy privilege.
So the rich got richer.
And the poor got poorer.
Literally. In the 50 years before 1789, prices and rents rose by a half. Wages went up just a quarter. People were hungry. Some were starving.
Arthur Young thought this was a disgrace. He was a farmer. He was familiar with the latest farming techniques used in England to increase food production, but it seemed the French nobility were ignoring their responsibilities.
The great lords love too much their forests, their boars, their huntsmen. They can't be bothered to manage their farms properly, or look after the peasants. You find fields wasted, whole estates no better than a desert. Oh, if I were King of France for a day, I'd make these lords jump.
And then there was the church. The church too was immensely rich. And like the nobility, members of the church were privileged. They didn't pay tax either. This is Saint-Germain, once the richest abbey in France. The abbot here earned 300,000 livres a year, a fortune in those days. Arthur Young came here to admire the pillars of African marble, but the extravagance he witnessed stuck in his throat.
I lose my patience at the abuse of such wealth. Just a quarter of this income would establish a noble farm. What turnips? What cabbages? And are these things not better than a fat priest?
Privilege and poverty. That's how Young sums it up. This print makes the same point. The nobility and the clergy riding on the backs of the peasantry. And Young could feel the rising tide of resentment, the call for reform. He wrote of
A great ferment amongst all ranks of men, all too eager for change.
But how would change come? With no parliament, no elections, who had the power to push through reform?
this is where the power in France was held. The Palace of Versailles, home to King Louis XVI, the absolute ruler of France. It wasn't just for the king. Versailles housed the royal court, about 10,000 people in all. Nobles came from far and wide to win the king's favour, to play a part in government. It was a place of intrigue and gossip and pompous ceremony. Arthur Young visited Versailles in 1787. It was an opportunity to watch the most powerful man in France flex his political muscles. This is how he described the king in action.
He seemed, by his inattention, to wish himself a hunting.
Truth is, Louis wasn't a great leader. He was shy and a bit dim. And although he wanted to improve things for his fellow countrymen, he wasn't able to push through any of the reforms France needed. As Arthur Young put it,
There exists a king on the throne with an excellent disposition, but without the resources of mind to take decisions.
In Young's opinion, that spelt disaster.
Unless some master hand is found at the helm to guide events, events will soon ferment into a motion of their own.
he wrote those words in 1789, just before returning to England. France, meanwhile, was like a bomb waiting to explode. All it needed was a spark.